In today's tutorial, I'm going to use my Artograph Light Pad to watercolor a little section of a poppy design that I have. And what that's going to do is make it stand out from the detail of the stamped version of the poppy. And I call this a mirage technique because I have a little mirage of painted artwork in the center of a very precise image. So what I've done is just taken the poppy stamp and stamped it on some white cardstock, which I have secured down to my light pad with some post-it note flags. And then I took a piece of watercolor paper that's about 1.5 inches smaller than basically the size of a card front. And I have adhered that on top of the cardstock, also down to my light pad. And the reason for this is that when I put this card together, I want these two sets of images to line up. Then what I'm doing is I'm taking my aqua painter and some Derwent Inktense Pencils, which I love, like I love the sun. And I'm just picking up a little bit of color from the Derwent pencils and very roughly sketching in my images with the light pad turned on. Now I would recommend being careful as you get near the edges of the design if you're using the stamped image underneath for your actual finished project, because what I'm trying to do is avoid getting any color on that bottom image at all. And the reason that I am going to keep that bottom image as the front of my card is because if I stamp it again, I run the risk that the two images won't line up, that I maybe won't stamp it in exactly the same place on the card front. And so I'm just being careful to make sure I don't get any watercolor on the bottom. I do turn off my light pad. Whenever I'm working on a project like this, I'll turn it off a few times as I'm filling in the general details, just to check my work. And then as I get towards the end, you'll see I just kind of leave it off. Now, as you color with the Derwent pencils, first of all, it's amazing how much pigment you can pick up with just touching the brush of your aqua painter to the tip of the pencil. But you can see I have variation in the tone, and that just comes from as the pigment is coming off my aqua painter. As I paint, the tone gets a little bit lighter, and so I just use that to my advantage, and I start coloring when I first pick up the pigment at what would naturally be the darkest part of the image, in this case the bottom of the flowers and the edges. And then I work my way into the sections of the flower that would be lighter. But you can also just come back later, which I'll do, you'll see, with darker, more fresh pigment and use that to color in the areas that you want shaded. The stems of these flowers are very easy. I'm just using a light green and very roughly following the outline of the stems, making them darker again at the top where they would naturally be darker because of a shadow from the flower. And then as I color, the pigment naturally gets lighter towards the bottom of the image. When you're doing an image like this, the easiest thing in the world is to forget one of the elements of the design. So I always have to turn the light pad off to check and make sure that I haven't forgotten a stem and I don't have a disembodied poppy floating in the air. And that happens sometimes. Now I come in with a deeper olive green, and I give both the top of the stem a little bit of shadow, but also one side of the stem just a little more definition. And it also tones down the sort of springy green that I started with. And you can see how it changes the tone just a bit. What's great about using the light pad to paint is that I'm not very good at painting. So what the light pad allows me to do is use an original design from somebody who knows what they're doing as my guide, and then I can just come in and make it look like I really do know how to paint, using that as a backdrop. The other thing that it does is it actually helps me learn how to paint, because it teaches me where light and shadow are naturally on the images that I'm using on the light pad. And it teaches me how to judge that for myself in original images that I might create later on. Watercolor is one of my favorite mediums for this method because it is so forgiving. It has kind of a natural imprecision about it, which I like, and gives you a little bit of leeway if you're not very confident in your painting skills. And that softness is such a nice contrast to the detailed images that I use watercolor with, that I think it really adds something special to especially detail-lined stamp images. Now I'm taking the orange Inktense and I'm going back over the poppies to add that signature poppy combination of orange and red to each of these flowers before I add detail. And to do this, it's best to do it with the light pad off. You can't really see where that color needs to go with the light pad on. So I have the general forms of the flowers ready to go. And I'm ready to add just a little bit more definition, coming back in with a darker red and adding some of that veining that you can see in my stamp image that I'm using as a base. So again, I'm just doing this with the same color red. Mine is naturally going to be a lot softer than the detailed image, but I do want to add that shading, and the fine tip of the aqua painter lets me kind of ghost in a little bit of that detail from the image. Another fun thing about using pencils like this to watercolor, I love watercolor any way I can get it, whether that's tube watercolor or using my water-based re-inkers as a medium or with markers or anything. But what's nice about this pencil version, especially since I am working directly on my light pad, is that it is so neat. It doesn't require a plate or anything to hold any liquid. The water's in my pen and the pigment's on a dry pencil. And that makes it both very neat and accident-free, but it also makes it portable. So it's a fun watercolor method if you're headed outside, or like one of our local artists here in town who likes to paint on the bus and the train. If you're a commuting painter, this is a great way to pass your time while you're on public transportation. Now I think I have most of the detail that I need in the poppies. And so what I'm going to do is come back in with, this pencil is called Bark, and it's just a very, very deep brown, almost black. And I'm going to add the little poppy seeds in the center of the flower just with the tip of my aqua painter. Again, not as precise as the stamp image itself, but very precise for watercolor. That's what I love about these synthetic water brushes, is they hold their point so well. Now, if you want to dampen down the intensity of the color that you're using, I actually use my light pad as a palette. So when I come back in a little while and I add the sky, I actually take a little pigment off the pencil and I sort of scribble on the light pad with the aqua painter until some of the pigment comes off and I have a lighter blue. And that's what's great about this surface. As long as you don't have too much water, you obviously don't want to get the whole thing wet, but on that glass surface you can have a small amount of your pigment, and then you can just wipe it off with a wet paper towel. Now the bark also makes a good shadow inside the flowers themselves, so I've added a few little shadows just to give some detail. Again, not too much. I like the more artistic look here. Now I won't make you watch me finish doing this, but I do come back with just a blue pencil, and I add a little bit of sky around some of the flowers, and then I just take my watercolored panel and I add it to the detailed image that I'm using for my card base, and I have a little mirage of soft painted watercolor inside my detailed stamped image.